Hey guys! Alright, so here is the makeup presentation for Chapter 14, Architecture. As you can see from your study guide here and from your images, this is pretty basic. We're not going into the names of the structures or the styles of architecture, so much as just the basic functions of how these stand up. And I am taking the grand field of architecture and breaking it down into absurdly simple and basic qualifiers. So as far as the test is concerned, it's just a matter of looking at a structure and knowing what method of architecture was used for it, and just some basic vocabulary terms that come along with architecture. Right, so getting right into it. Our oldest forms of architecture are this first method, masonry, which just involves taking rocks, stacking them on top of each other to form a structure, to form walls. This is an example of masonry. Other examples that your textbook could have chosen include Machu Picchu, of course the Great Pyramids, the Great Wall of China, all ancient structures that utilize masonry. I am glad, though, as an aside, that your book chose this site to illustrate masonry. This is the Great Enclosure, the Great Zimbabwe, in the African country of Zimbabwe. So as we take a look around this site, you can see that it's full of these very thick walls. They're like 14 feet thick at the base, tapering upwards. And this is an example of a site that is made of masonry. And yeah, as I said, I'm glad that of all the masonry structures that the book could have chosen, it chose a sub-Saharan African one. Kind of a weird fact about it, whenever it was first documented by Western explorers, they came up with all sorts of stupid theories about who could have built it and why. Basically, they couldn't accept that an African culture was capable of building something so advanced. It's kind of like those people who say that aliens built the pyramids. It's like, no, people of indigenous cultures built that. Right, so on the test, what type of architectural technique is used here? Answer, masonry. But we can break this down into specifics. Depending on whether or not the masonry that you use, the stones that you use, are just found stones held together, which is an example of rubble masonry, or a term that is on the test, dressed stones, also known as ashlar masonry. This is whenever you use natural stones, but they have been cut or shaped before they have been stacked together. So it's not just rubble and boulders held in place with smaller, but actual dressed stones. So normally in class, I show other pictures of the Great Zimbabwe, and I asked, so is this rubble masonry, or have these stones been dressed? And the answer is that they have been dressed. The architects who constructed the Zimbabwe, they shaped the stone to basic brick shape before using it. I think, though, it trips people up because, as you can see, they're not all uniform bricks. They are hand-cut bricks, but they have been cut and shaped by hand. So yes, this is dressed stone masonry. Rather impressive. Right, so dressed stones is one of your vocab terms. It is a term that comes with the technique of masonry. All right. Next up, the architectural technique of post and beam. I always learned it as post and lintel, L-I-N-T-E-L. This is the post, and this is the beam. So this is any sort of structure that has walls and a roof over it. You can probably take a look at the illustration here and think of a famous example. Stonehenge in England is a post and beam structure. Also, the Pantheon of Egypt, or the Pantheon, excuse me, of Athens, Egyptian temples that you can see here. And chances are the room that you're in right now has basic load-bearing walls and a horizontal beam over your head. So the obvious advantage here is you can have much thinner structures, you can have an interior structure, load-bearing walls, and a roof over your head. These, again, are the posts. These are the beams. So again, as far as testing goes, that's pretty much it. What type of architectural technique is seen here? Answer, post and beam. As a little aside, though, just because I really like architecture, if you've looked ahead in the homework options, you might have noticed that there's a homework option where you go hunting for column styles. This is something that you see often in post and beam architecture. The vertical posts become more decorative. The styles that you'll be looking for include Corinthian, Doric, and Ionic. This is actually the basis for all three. These are Egyptian-style columns, and they have actually been designed to look like bundles of reeds held together with bands, and this gave way to the vertical fluting that you see on Greek and Roman-style columns. But yes, this is all post and beam architecture. But one of the big problems of post and beam system is that the weight of the stone goes directly downwards. So whenever you're dealing with heavy materials like natural stone, you can see how close together the posts have to be. If you were to spread this out, it wouldn't be a supported structure. It would start to buckle in the middle. Don't worry about the terms here. This is just to illustrate one of the downfalls of the post and beam system, which is resolved by this variation. Okay, the round arch. This is something that the Romans innovated, at least in terms of an above-ground, unsupported structure. The great thing about the round arch is that it is self-supporting. The weight of the stones isn't going directly downward, but rather outward and downward. It is a self-supporting structure and is very, very efficient. It's also very versatile. As always, anytime you see terms that are in parentheses, that's a signal that they won't be on the test. But this is just to show you the different, you might say, flavors that arches come in. The example that's going to be on your test is this one. So this is one of the famous Roman aqueducts. Take a look at the date. It was built in the year 15 Common Era. And something that I always found remarkable about the Roman aqueduct here in Nimes is that it was built in just 5 years. Every time I drive on Highway 16 all the way up to Pooler, and I'm looking at all that construction, and I think about how long it's been going on, and I just think to myself, geez, the Romans built the aqueducts in 5 years. And it's taking Savannah how long to build this overpass? Anyway, so this is a panorama of the Pont du Gard. This, of course, is a modern bridge, but obviously the original first-century structure is still absolutely fine. Although I guess it tends to swallow people's legs whenever they walk along it. I like looking at panoramas of these famous architectural sites. But yes, this is an example of a round arch, a self-supporting structure. You can see how thick and heavy the supports are at the bottom, but after all these years, still standing strong. Very efficient method of architecture. This would be an example of an arcade, a series of arches, one after another. Again, not a term you have to worry about, but do have a look at domes. This is an arch that's just been rotated 360 degrees. And whenever it comes to domes, you can see it comes in a few different variations. You can place your dome directly on the ground, like a little igloo of sorts. You can put a dome on a cylinder. This is also called a dome on a drum. Or, vocab, you can place your dome on pendentives. This is one of your vocabulary terms. What is a pendentive? It supports a dome. And normally in class, I compare these two and I ask, which one's better? And what's the advantage of the pendentive system? So as you can see with pendentives, these curving sort of triangle shapes, they're supporting the weight of the dome. And you can see that the entire weight of the dome has been concentrated to 4 load-bearing supports, as opposed to a dome on a drum, which is 360 degrees of load-bearing supports. So whenever I ask, why is this better? People usually point out that you get more square footage and that it's much more open. It relies less on load-bearing walls and instead on 4 load-bearing points supported by pendentives. Just as an aside, if we want to see an example of a dome on a drum, this is my favorite building in Rome. This is the Pantheon. It is a dome on a cylinder. As we take a look inside, here's a beautiful dome, sort of a half circle. And by the way, it is open inside the Pantheon. That's a 17-foot wide window. And that and the doorway are the only openings in this structure. It's otherwise completely closed off. But if we want an example of a dome on pendentives, the most famous example would be the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Turkey, formerly Constantinople. This was built in the 6th century. I do have a panorama. I've always wanted to go here, maybe someday. So this is the interior of the Hagia Sophia. Much larger than the interior of the Pantheon, and you can see it employs many, many more windows. This is right underneath the central dome, and these, 1, 2, 3, 4, are the pendentives. Excuse me. Right. Yeah, so these are the pendentives. You can just see how thick they are and how sturdy the supports underneath them are. But they're the ones who are supporting the full weight of the dome, which means that the other walls can be opened up for more architectural features, including more windows. So it's a much higher, much lighter, much brighter structure than the Roman Pantheon. The interesting thing about the Hagia Sophia is that originally it was built to be a Christian basilica, an Orthodox Christian basilica, and it does retain some of its original Christian decorations, like this image of the Virgin Mary here and these seraphim on the pendentives. But of course, it also has Islamic elements as well. During the Islamic conquest, the Hagia Sophia was converted from a basilica, a Christian Orthodox place of worship, to an Islamic one. And many of the original Christian mosaics were covered up and plastered over. In the 1930s, though, they worked to desacralize the church and preserve both of its faiths. So it's been pretty much equal parts a place of worship for Christians and for Muslims. It's really emblematic of Turkey, where the East meets the West. It's a fascinating building, beautiful interior. Yeah, I'll take you guys on a road trip whenever I win the lottery. But I am just a poor teacher. And before I was a poor teacher, I was a poor little tour guide. So I like to show local examples of these styles of architecture. Round arches in modern architecture are known as Romanesque style buildings. It happens to be my favorite style of architecture. So anytime you see a round arch, just think round, Roman, Romanesque. These are some examples of round arches to be found in the historic district. All right, so we've seen masonry, post and beam, round arch, domes and pendentives, and now the pointed arch. So it doesn't seem like that big of a difference between the round arch and the pointed arch, and in some ways the pointed arch is actually a little bit worse. If you think about like an RPG style stat sheet, it gives you more height, but structurally it's weaker. So I often ask students, if I were to build this structure out of cardboard and I were to extend these legs down another 10 feet, where is she going to break? And you might be able to guess here. You can imagine the walls wanting to fold outward and this ceiling wanting to collapse in. It's not as self-supporting as the round arch is, but it does take up less space and it gives you more height. So whenever you have pointed arches, it does place a bit more stress on the places where the arch meets the wall, and this is why pointed arches often employ buttresses. This, as you can see, is one of your vocabulary terms. What is a buttress? It is the exterior support for a wall, arch, or vault, seen mostly in pointed arch structures. Gothic style structures. That's the name of this style that incorporates pointed arches. So as far as the test is concerned, you just need to know the term buttress. It's an exterior support for a wall. And you can just take a look at it and see exactly what is there doing. It's like an arm reaching out to support the walls. Most people think of flying buttresses whenever they think of buttresses, as we can see here, but there's also concealed buttresses, which you sometimes see in buildings. So here you can see this is the buttress, but it's been concealed, it's been closed off. But if you have a freestanding arch and a freestanding support, that's what's known as a flying buttress. So for examples of Gothic style architecture, your textbook gives the example of Chartres, Notre Dame de Chartres in France. If we take a look at the outside, you can see that these are the buttresses. It's kind of an odd angle, but you can see the arches here that are supporting the weight of the walls, holding them up. These are flying buttresses for the most part. You can see the arches up here. You can see how large the windows are. For a local example of Gothic style architecture, this is our local Christian Catholic cathedral. This is the Basilica of St. John the Baptist. This is also done in the Gothic style. We can compare it to the interior of Chartres. See that they both employ pointed arches. But if we take a look at the outside, we can see that the buttresses here in Savannah are actually concealed buttresses. They're not flying arches. The space between every one of these buttresses has been closed off. But I'm getting technical now. As far as test is concerned, what is this? This is the pointed arch. It's called the Gothic arch, and it is necessarily supported by buttresses. All right, here's another fun Gothic building. This one's one of my favorites. Congregation Mikveh Israel is actually a synagogue, not a cathedral, and it's actually the only fully Gothic revival-style synagogue in the entire country. It's kind of a fun little example of this style of architecture. All right, so again, simplifying to the extreme, this is what most architecture is. Masonry, post and beam, round arch, and pointed arch. Excuse me. From here on out, the main innovations aren't so much in the shape of the structure, you might say, as the materials. So here in the mid-19th century, you can see that iron starts to be used as a construction method. So as far as the method of architecture, this is basically just post and beam and a barrel vault, a round arch. The innovation here isn't in the design of the structure so much as what the structure is made of. So test question is the Crystal Palace of London. It's one of the first buildings to highlight this architectural material. It's one of the first large buildings built entirely of cast iron. It was actually supposed to be just a temporary structure for this great exhibition in 1850. It was kind of like a World's Fair. The entire building was built in just a few months. I don't have my notes here, but I think it's like 19 acres of land, and it was built in just like 5 or 6 months, all prefabricated glass and cast iron. And it was meant to be just this temporary exhibition of international arts and inventions. But after the fair was over, the Crystal Palace was so popular that it was actually deassembled, sort of folded flat and shipped to just outside of London in Sydenham Hill. And this was seen as one of the first real modern buildings. The idea of architecture that's naked, that's not disguising itself in grand veneers, but it's just very honest, open architecture. People also thought that this was going to be the end of great fires, like the one that destroyed London in 1666. Unfortunately, as we now know, cast iron is very vulnerable to heat, especially whenever the beams are fully exposed as they are here. So sadly, this wonderful building, the beautiful Crystal Palace, is no more. In 1936, this lovely wooden floor caught on fire. The trees that were actually still inside the structure all burned up, and the entire building collapsed in on itself overnight in 1936. So, alas, no more Crystal Palace in Savannah, or in London. And this also marked the end of the popularity of cast iron as a building material. But you see it a lot in mid to late 19th century structures. And just as a bit of local flavor, the Kehoe House is a famous example of this. William Kehoe owned an ironworks foundry here in Savannah, did a lot of the decorative cast and wrought iron around town, and actually used his house as a way to show off what his company can do. Everything that you see on the Kehoe House that's white is a cast iron decor made by his foundry. It's a fun mix of Georgian, French Revival, Elizabethan, neoclassical, Greco-Roman styles of architecture, sort of like a three-dimensional catalog for William Kehoe's business. The structure of the house is also supported by cast iron struts and supports. Right, but again, this is basically just post and beam systems, just with a different material. As is this, steel frame construction, which replaced cast iron as a building material in the late 19th century. Steel is much less likely to buckle upon exposure to heat, much stronger, much lighter, and this gives way to the famous skyscrapers that one might see in major cities. I actually didn't put steel frame construction on the test. This is just to show you that this is more or less the same ideas as we see at Stonehenge. It's post and beam. It's just a sturdier method. For a local example of one of these early steel frame structures, we can head down to Bankers Square, Johnson Square, and take a look at this building here on the corner of Bull Street. This is one I want you to take note of, the international style. All right, so let's compare this architectural rendering with steel frame architecture. In a way, they're similar. It involves load-bearing posts and a ceiling overhead, the beam. But can you spot the difference? And obviously this is 4 stories and this is 2, but take a look at where the posts are placed. Do you see the difference? With the international style, they're not in the walls. International style is non-load-bearing walls. Instead, interior columns support the weight of the structure. So international style buildings give way to what we often see in modern architecture, which is floor-to-ceiling glass. International style often has a sort of layer cake look to it. So the big difference here is the use of non-load-bearing walls. If we actually go back to this building here, this is a great example of a steel frame style building. And right in the background, you can see an international style building with that sort of, again, layer cake look. You can see that it doesn't have those vertical posts that are supporting the weights of the ceilings. Instead, all of the supports are interior. So yeah, on the test, this is an example of what method of construction? It's called the international style. For a local example, we can head over downtown to Drayton Towers. This is kind of a rough picture. This is before, excuse me, before it was restored. It looks more or less like this now. Modern apartments right in the heart of downtown. And if we take a look at the inside during the restoration process, before, after, you can definitely get a sense of what this style is about. These are the interior load-bearing supports. And whenever they renovated this building, they just cleared out all of the interior walls and just left these supports because there are no load-bearing walls in the international style. A lot of people consider this to be the ugliest building in downtown, but personally, I think the worst building in Savannah is right across the street from it, the dreaded Hilton. It's not that bad as a building. The reason why I have such a sore spot about it is because this is what they tore down to build it. The beautiful, iconic, historic DeSoto Hotel, built in 1890. A beautiful Romanesque-style luxury hotel. Sadly, this whole building was demolished in 1966 to build a Hilton franchise hotel instead. It's since been rebranded. They've dropped the Hilton affiliate. If you go downtown, it's just called the DeSoto Hotel. But I think that's kind of a slap in the face to the original DeSoto. And I'll go ahead and be explicit. This is a bonus question. Which building in downtown Savannah was destroyed to build a Hilton hotel? Answer, the DeSoto. Such a shame. And really, that's about it. The textbook goes on to other forms of modern architecture, including modern skyscrapers. I often poll the class and ask, what do they think of this saying, less is more in modern architecture? Personally, I'm not a fan of sleek, efficient, beauty-free modern architecture. And luckily, we do have a lot of architects who still do keep beauty alive in their structures, including modern designer Frank Gehry. But as far as my COVID-afflicted throat is concerned, that's it for architecture. It's just a matter of looking at the name of, or looking at a picture of the building and telling me what method of architecture was used there. Cast iron, international style. These are flying buttresses, etc. You can probably figure it out. So thank you so much for your time as you listen to this makeup lecture. All right, bye.